We usually start these conversations with some historical context. We might start with the invasion of the Mongolian Empire into Europe, or some obscure figure in history, or all kinds of things. From like the introduction of Star Wars, we start in a long, long ago in a land far, far away. But today we're not going to do that. Today I'm going to go back just a couple of days to this past weekend, to what is easily my favorite time of year, and probably of all the things that I do, the thing that I get most fired up about every single year. And if you've been a subscriber to Sovereign Man Notes from the Field for any length of time, you've heard about this. This is the annual entrepreneurship camp that my team and I sponsor every year. We do this in Lithuania. And what we do is we bring young people from all over the world, and boy, do they come from everywhere. Australia and Brazil and Canada and the United Kingdom and Germany and Romania and Ghana and Israel and Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and Nigeria. Everywhere you could possibly imagine. People come from all over the world to participate in this. And what we try and do every year is I bring some of the most successful and accomplished, independent-minded, brilliant instructors that I can think of. People have achieved a tremendous amount of success in their various fields from all over. And we come and we spend 5 days together in a quiet countryside resort on the lake in Lithuania. And it is absolutely fantastic. It's so energizing. For many, it's life-changing. And for me, again, out of all the things that I do, and I'm involved in so many wonderful things, it is for me probably one of the most important things that I'm involved in. Because we really try to, I believe that the traditional educational system has completely failed entire generations of people. People grow up from the time they're 4 or 5 years old, indoctrinated into a state-sponsored education system, learning to subordinate themselves to the government, learning about a government's version of history, learning about things that are irrelevant, not really learning how the world works. And we try and cram into 5 days things that have taken us years and years and years to learn, cumulatively, all the instructors together, things about how business actually works, how the world actually works, how money and banking actually works. And again, for many of our students, we've done this 5 years in a row. We've helped a couple of hundred people by now. It has been, for many, very life-changing. It's something that I'm incredibly proud to be a part of. It's so energizing. It is so energizing to be around young people that truly inspire you to what the future could really be like. We had one young lady from Malaysia who is a bona fide card-carrying revolutionary. This girl organizes protests for hundreds of thousands of people, trying to shine a huge spotlight on all the corruption and impropriety that's going on in the government of that country. We had a young man who used to be a professional hockey player, who had left hockey, started, built up, and already sold his first business, and he's still in his early mid-20s. Another young man from Spain. Of course, you know anything about Spain, the youth unemployment rate. 2 out of every 3 young people can't find a job. This was a guy who had a job, and he quit. He quit his job. And it was something that everybody thought he was crazy. His family, his friends, everybody thought he was crazy. And he quit his job. He followed his passion. He started a business. And he's doing spectacular. He's practically mopping the floor with Amazon in his particular industry. It's amazing. We had a programmer who had built and sold one of the most successful mobile apps in Central Europe. The one particular gentleman you'll probably be hearing more about, my new favorite musician. If talent is any indicator at all, I'm convinced that Ian is going to be one day much more famous than Bono. Absolutely incredible. Another young man was a former Goldman Sachs alumni. He went on to co-found one of the most exciting retail product startups in the world. It's going to be probably one of the next. I'm convinced it's probably going to end up being sold for $1 billion, go public. It's already wildly successful. You'll probably be hearing more about it. I'm actually an early investor. And if you're a subscriber to Sovereign Man Private Investing, you may actually be hearing about this relatively soon. We have artists, we have inventors, programmers, entrepreneurs, dreamers. It's really enough to make you fired up about the future. It's certainly enough to make me really fired up about the future, and it makes me think it is truly a bright future. We talk about things all the time about really what's happening in the world. And, obviously, everywhere you look in the world, there is no shortage of let's say at a minimum, concerning news. We can see fundamentals from from all corners of the world, in Europe and in Asia, Japan. I mean, things are getting incredibly uncomfortable. Tim Price, my friend, and in many cases, I have so much respect for Tim Price and his investment ethos. He wrote a letter we published yesterday talking about Jim Stockdale, went on to become a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy, and his just horrible experience after he got shot down over North Vietnam in 1965, and he said, very clearly, he was talking about when he was in this POW camp. This was in the book Good to Great. By Jim Collins. And he said, very clearly that you have to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And, the brutal facts of our current reality is that the richest countries in the world, the richest governments in the world are heavily in debt, that central bankers have their backs against the wall. They have printed so much money and they have not been able to substantially move the needle that here in this part of the world, here in Europe, they've actually had to reduce certain interest rates to below zero. They have negative interest rates. And even when they come out with good economic news and they say, oh, the economy's growing so quickly, they still can't move interest rates from zero because everybody's addicted to this cheap money. It's created so many bubbles and distortions where we simultaneously have, peak stock market and peak bond market and peak everything. Everything has become, it's just asset bubbles and rising inflation everywhere. And all these are massive indicators that there are serious problems coming, whether that comes now or tomorrow or 6 months from now or 2 years from now. The time frame is really irrelevant. Again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at the totality of all these factors and see that there's something very, very clearly wrong with the system. And yet, in light of all that, in the face of all that, I can still spend a couple of days around these tremendously bright young people and be objectively optimistic about the future. I can look at the facts and I can see everything that's happening, and yet I can still have a very solid attitude about the future simply because of the people that I see and I believe the ethos that they're going to carry with them. I'll tell you a couple things that we talk about at these camps. One of the things, I think the most important thing they keep hearing from me over and over again is this concept of value. We always talk about this. We say, look, transactions. Anytime you make any kind of transaction, what you're really doing is you're trading your paper currency for something that you value more than the currency, rent and food and whatever, mobile phones and all those sorts of things. You value the mobile phone more than the paper currency that you had to pay to get that mobile phone. And it's that concept of value. Value is really fundamentally, the expression of what we do in this world. And building wealth really means that you're creating value somehow. If you want to build wealth, you can create value. That means you're working in a business, you're doing something valuable for that business, or you have a profession, or you start a business yourself, or you're creating art or something like that. All that creation, creating value is a great way to build wealth, and that's the thing that we're constantly reinforcing to our students, is find that value creation mechanism. But of course, the other way to build wealth in the world isn't to create value, it's to take value that others have created. And this is ultimately what governments do. That's really what taxation is. Taxation is just the theft of value that's been created by other people. We tell this to our students, that you can go out and start a business tomorrow, and whether you realize it or not, you're going to have a silent partner. You're going to have a silent partner that's going to take a significant cut of everything that you ever do in your entire life. Every penny that you ever earn in profit, you have a silent partner that's going to have his hand out for his fair share of the profits that you've generated in your business, or the earnings that you generate as a professional or as an employee or a manager or an engineer, or whatever it is that you go out and do. You have a silent partner in everything. And of course, that silent partner is the government. And they take all that money, they take all those earnings, and of course they go and squander it. They go and, build bridges to nowhere, and of course, most destructively, they go and they drop bombs and they wage wars. And I tell everybody, it's just my own personal ethos is, I believe that we all truly actually have a moral obligation to minimize this. I've never wanted to encourage people to not pay taxes. That's a great way to end up in a Dayglow orange jumpsuit, turning big rocks into little rocks. It's just not something I think that's worth it. I think taxes are immoral. I think that this concept of governments having their hand out for their fair share of your hard-earned labor. I mean, this is This is, I think this is an absurd notion. But not doing that, whether it's right or wrong, legal, illegal, everybody has their own arguments about this. Not doing it is pretty much guarantees you a one-way ticket into the jailhouse. It's not worth it. That said, I think we have a moral obligation to minimize. There are so many legal strategies to minimize the amount that we pay in taxes. It's not even about keeping more money in our pockets. Of course, that's a nice thing. To me, it's almost the moral obligation to ensure that the politicians who receive our tax revenues, the people that go out and wage war and the people that write the checks for all these things, we have a moral obligation to ensure they have as few resources as possible. This is the starve the beast approach. We have a moral obligation to minimize the resources they have at their disposal, because the fewer dollars and euros and yen and renminbi and pounds and so forth that we pay out to politicians is the fewer bombs and the fewer drones and the fewer spy agencies and the fewer wars that are waged out there in the world. It's fewer bureaucrats to tell us what we can and cannot put in our bodies. It's fewer bureaucrats to tell us, whether or not we can collect rainwater, and fewer bureaucrats who award monopolies to big companies like Monsanto who go and put poison in the food supply and so forth. The fewer resources that they have, the less they're going to be able to do that. And so I think it's imperative. I think we have a moral obligation. If people really want to have some effect over change and so forth, economics is the most powerful form of change. Money, finance, this is the most powerful form of change. And if we control what we actually do with our resources and we try and limit the resources that we pay to this sort of entirely destructive institution of government, the better off really we'll all be. We also talk to our students about something that's very simple. We talk a lot about investing as well. I mean, people always want to hear about stocks and bonds and real estate and so forth. And, those things can be great. I invest a lot in private businesses. Everybody knows this. But I tell people, particularly when you're young, the best investment that you can possibly make is the one you make in yourself. The education that you learn, real education. I'm not talking about a university degree or an MBA or anything like that. For some people, that's a great ticket to work their way up a corporate ladder, and in many cases, that's still necessary. But I'm talking about learning real skills, tangible skills. It's always such a compliment for us. We had 6 instructors this year, and people came up to us and they said, I've been going to school. I mean, people have master's degrees and so forth. They end up in our camp, and they say, I learned more here than I did in 4 years of university and 3 years of graduate school and so forth. It's just the sort of stuff that you just don't learn anywhere, and that's because I think that in many university situations, they don't really teach you how the world works. They teach you about how stuff works in a textbook. In investing, they talk about efficient market hypothesis and so forth. There's nothing really efficient about markets. If markets were efficient, then we wouldn't have all these distortions and misallocations of capital. Of course, markets aren't efficient. That's why we have all these massive distortions. That's why we have a central banking system. We have an entire monetary supply, an entire money supply that's ruled by a tiny central banking elite. There's absolutely nothing efficient about that whatsoever. It creates massive distortions in the marketplace. Market participants are highly irrational, right? You would think that people would understand if you're a market professional and you see a really great company, and the company has, almost no debt, and the company has, really great productive assets and a strong cash flow generation, and suddenly the stock price starts falling. As a market participant, you would think, a rational market participant would think, hey, that's a good thing, right? I'm buying this great company. I'm buying all this value creation potential at a significant discount. But no, that's not what happens. What happens is people see the stock price fall and they say, oh my God, I got to start selling. So everybody else just jumps on the bandwagon and starts selling. That's not rational. That's irrational. That's not efficient. That's completely inefficient. We talked about this a lot with you look at the junior mining sector right now, and you've got so many companies. Many companies are even profitable. And their market capitalizations are literally less than the amount that the company has in cash. So you see a company. I remember this actually in the early days of the financial crisis. Probably the best example I think was Fortuna Silver. I want to say it had a market cap of $45 million, is making $2 million a year, and have $55 million in cash in the bank with no debt. So if you just happen to have $45 million laying around, you could have bought the company. Obviously, it would have pushed the stock price up. But in theory, you could have bought the company, pulled out your entire $45 million. So you've been net even, had, been in a positive position of $10 million and be making $2 million a year. I mean, this was an absurd valuation. That's not efficient. That's inefficient. And we still see this stuff all over the world today. It's highly inefficient that The U.S. government debt is considered to be the risk-free rate. The greatest debtor that's ever existed in the history of the world that has $17.6 trillion in debt is considered to be risk-free. That's not efficient. That's not rational. That is absurd. It's crazy. But this is what they teach in textbooks. That's not how the world works. The best investment you can make is in real education, in really how the world works. And that stuff is out there. Obviously, this is the sort of stuff that we talk about all the time in Sovereign Man, Sovereign Man Confidential, and so forth. It's the sort of stuff we talk about in our camps. I also think it's the thing we often encourage people to do is get out there in the world and travel. You really start to see how the world works when you travel across Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America and so forth. You see developing countries. You see how the world really works. You start seeing where the opportunities really are. You start seeing how other people live and how things should be and might be and could be. This is real education. This is real education, not stuff that's found in a textbook in a university class in some sterile academic environment. Real education really counts. Real skills, sales. I mean, this is a huge skill. I mean, the ability, we tell people this as well. I mean, you always learn how to sell something. Even if you have absolutely no idea what to do, selling something is really scary for a lot of people. Sitting down in front of another person, looking them straight in the eye and telling, and trying to actually deliver something of value to them, a product of value to them, and ask them for money, that is a really hard thing for a lot of people to do. Knowing how to do that is obviously a very effective and critical skill. Languages and and so forth. Being able to bring people together and form a single company. Being able to pull together different elements of value from disparate companies and bring them together. All these different things. These are skills that people can learn. Real skills. Again, stuff that's not taught really in a university classroom. Looking at where the trends are in the future. Obviously, I'm very bullish on agriculture. That actually sounds like a pun, but it wasn't intended. I'm very bullish on agriculture. I think people that really learn about agriculture and look at agricultural technology and agribusiness opportunities, these are the sorts of things I think that can make people tremendously wealthy. There's a lot of value to be created in agriculture, and this is something that folks can really learn about. So this is, I think, the best investment that people can possibly make. If you're sitting there, particularly if you have not a substantial amount of savings, if you're looking at $5,000, $10,000 and think, where can I put my money where I can get the most, the biggest bang for my buck? The biggest bang for your buck is going to be the investment that you make in yourself by far. Because with that extra knowledge, you'll be able to create more value in whatever it is you're doing. If it's, if you have a job, you'll be able to create more value in your job. It makes you a much more valuable employee, puts you in line where you'll be able to get a raise, a promotion, and so forth. If you have if you have your own business, or it might be able to expand the products and services that you're able to offer in your business, or maybe be able to create a business or an entire new line of services. If you're an independent professional, the investment that you make in yourself, that knowledge can really pay massive dividends, much, much more than just investing in some stock, which is, by the way, completely manipulated by central banks. Another thing I wanted to mention, this is a big thing. Our students kept asking me this question. They said, Simon, what do you think is really going to happen? I mean, what's happening in the future? Where do you see the world going over the next 10 to 20 years? And I think it was an important question for a lot of these students. I mean, many of these, I shouldn't say kids, but it's hard to not. I mean, many of them are 20. We had people that were 17 years old. I mean, I didn't even know how old they were. They showed up and they said, oh, I'm 17. I'm still in high school. I was astounded. So incredibly mature and poised and just so intelligent and already going out there and kicking ass in the world. Really impressive people. And so, I think it's an important thing to look at and say, what do we think the world's going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? This is hugely important. One of my, key themes there, as I said, look, I think I obviously mentioned the agricultural thing, but I think our entire system of money and banking is going to be completely obsolete in 20 years. The technology already exists for that to be the case now. It's really just a question of adoption. When we think about banking, I was really impressed by one young lady. She's from Brazil, and her bank in Brazil, she found right before she left for Lithuania, found out that her bank in Brazil was going to charge her a 6% sort of ATM withdrawal fee and so forth. 6% of any money that she would pull out of an ATM. 6%. What a massive fee just to take cash out of a cash machine. And she thought, this is crazy. So what does she do? She got on Facebook and a bunch of social networking sites, and she basically went and found anybody who had currency that she wanted, who was willing to trade for the currency that she had. And so she said, hey, I have Brazilian money. I'm looking for euros. Is anybody willing to trade me? And she did this on social networking sites and so forth, in many cases with complete strangers. And she found a lot of people who said, hey, yeah, sure, that sounds great. Let's do that. So she went and she traded at exactly the market rate. No markup, no bank fee. And it was just one human being and another human being, two people who came together through a marketplace and made a transaction. I thought, that's awesome. That's incredible, right? That's, this is this peer-to-peer technology. This stuff exists today. What is a bank in this situation, right? Yeah, okay, it's a little fancy. You stick your card in an ATM machine and money comes out. But all the bank's really doing is taking a huge cut for being nothing but a middleman. That's it. The technology already exists today to completely eliminate that. If you think about all the services that banks fundamentally provide, being a repository of capital, being able to loan out money, all these things, all those technologies already exist. You think about loans, that technology already exists. There's so many sort of peer-to-peer lending platforms online where you can already go online today and go and get loans. Auto loans, business loans, micro loans, all this stuff already exists. It all exists. And it's being so rapidly expanded, the shared economy and all these things. It's being rapidly expanded to the point that, again, I believe in 20 years, the existing banking structure will be completely and totally obsolete. Digital currencies, cyber currencies, they obviously play a huge role in this. In many respects, again, of course, that technology already exists today. You can send funds across the world in an instant with any number of digital currencies, whether using Bitcoin or anything else. But more importantly, this is evolving so rapidly into a payment system. And there's many of these that exist today. I just saw that the co-founders of Stripe are launching their own payment system. I think they call it Stellar. I haven't read very much about this, but it's something that interests me. There's a number of these that now they're not even currencies anymore. They become entire payment platforms, almost sort of digital financial systems that exist outside of the banking system. This is the sort of thing, again, this technology already exists. You think of every single possible use, every service that a bank provides, the technology exists to eliminate the banks from that equation altogether. And that's seriously exciting, right? Because banks put themselves in this situation where they are the captains of the monetary system, right? You have central banks that are pulling all the strings and conjuring money out of thin air in their sole discretion, setting interest rates, setting the price of money. They're quantitative easing, taking interest rates negative. I mean, this is absurd. Right? There are already alternatives to that. What do you think about the traditional route like gold and silver, or you think about the digital route like Bitcoin and Litecoin and Startcoin and so forth? All these things, all of those already exist. Right? And there are all these controls in place to ensure that they can't just be conjured out of thin air in the sole discretion of a single human being. I mean, all that technology already exists. It's just a question of how quickly does it get adopted. And in many cases, like peer-to-peer lending, the adoption rates are astronomical. In the case of many digital currencies, the adoption rates are astronomical. And it's actually probably the best analogy I can make, and is one that my friend Jim Rickards writes about in his book, Currency Wars. I always say this: if you haven't read Currency Wars, I think it's one of the best books out there on money and banking and the utter and complete failure of our current central banking system. Jim Rickards, Currency Wars, great book. Definitely recommend you pick it up. And one of the things that he talks about, and he mentioned this, he came down to our event last year in Chile. If you were there, you probably remember this. We're sitting in a room. There's 500 attendees who came down to Chile for this, and Jim's in a room. He had just followed Nigel Farage, Jim Rogers, and Ron Paul. It was a really exciting morning. And Jim Rickards stood up and he told everybody, okay, there's about 500 people in the room. I'm paraphrasing the story, obviously. So there's about 500 people in the room. Let's say one guy stands up and walks towards the door. Nobody's really going to notice. Let's say 5 people stand up and walk to the door. Again, nobody's really going to notice. Let's say 20 people get up and walk towards the door. A few people are going to notice that, right? A few people are going to notice that, and they're going to say, wonder what's going on there, and they're going to get up and they're going to leave too. Let's say 50 people do it, 100 people do it, and so on and so on and so on. The more people stand up and head for the exit, the more other people are going to go, hey, something's going on, and they're going to stand up and follow. if 350 people simultaneously in a room full of 500 people, if 350 people of them, 70% of the room stands up and starts heading toward the exits, you could pretty much guarantee that almost every single other person in the room is going to presume, hey, something's going on, and they're going to stand up and follow. That's how this stuff works. Jim talks about that story with respect to the dollar. I think he's 100% correct. It's one of these things that is happening right in front of our eyes, where more and more people are now standing up and they're heading for the exits. We're seeing this. We're just seeing this all over the place. We've got now, senior politicians, for presidents and prime ministers. France and Canada and the UK, and people are saying, "Wait a minute, does it really make any sense anymore for the world to be using the dollar almost exclusively in international trade transactions? Does it make any sense at all for, a European aircraft manufacturer to be invoicing Lufthansa, a European airline, in dollars? Does that make any sense at all? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. This obviously needs to change. This is the French government saying this, the British government saying this, and the British government saying, hey, we want to be the International Renminbi Center. The Swiss are saying this. The Canadians are saying this. Everybody gets this. Everybody's starting to stand up and head towards the exit. This is so obvious. And more people are saying, hey, something's going on here, right? And so as that happens, more and more people stand up, what happens? It causes other people to stand up and head to the exits as well. And as those people stand up and head toward the exit, then more people say, hey, something's going on. And they stand up and they start heading towards the exit. Pretty soon then, who's the only person left sitting down? The U.S. government. Because they're the only people who still think that they get to call all the shots. Now, in the past, that was okay because they had the largest military in the world and they could spend any amount of money they wanted to on bombs and guns and drones and aircraft carriers and so forth. But now they can't, right? Too broke to go to war. Too broke to go to war. One of the things that the U.S. government was always in strong defense of was the petrodollar. This is something that is so critically important. Oil is the most widely traded commodity on the planet, bar none, no exceptions. Coffee is actually number 2. Most people don't realize that. Oil is so widely traded, and almost universally, in almost all cases, there are a few exceptions, but in almost all cases, oil tends to be traded in U.S. dollars. It doesn't matter if it's the Chinese importing it from Saudi Arabia, or if it's Chile importing it from Brazil. They do that deal in dollars. What does that mean? It means that the currencies, since the currency being used is the dollar, the transaction settles and closes and takes place through the New York banking system. This means by default that the New York banking system, the New York banks are the most powerful, the captains of global finance, right? They are the most powerful forces in the global financial system. And so if all of a sudden oil started being traded in other currencies other than the dollar, then what happens to demand for the dollar? Suddenly it starts to dry up rapidly. If demand for the dollar starts to dry up rapidly, then what sense is there for all these other countries to continue to hold dollars as their foreign reserves and their central bank reserves and so forth? Doesn't make as much sense. Suddenly, there are fewer and fewer dollars being held in the hands of foreigners because it doesn't make sense. Right now oil is being traded for euros, for gold, for renminbi, for anything else other than dollars. And so as that demand for dollars, specifically for trade settlement in oil, begins to fall, it means that the dollar's prominence begins to fall. It means that the power of the New York banking system begins to fall. This is something that in the past, the U.S. government was able to prevent at the point of a gun, at the point of a lot of guns, at the point of aircraft carriers and bombers and so forth. Now they can't afford it anymore. They're too broke. They're over 100% of their debt levels over 100% of GDP, $17.6 trillion. They can no longer afford it. And that's why we're starting to see this stuff unwind. We're starting to see countries, the Swiss just did a deal with the Chinese. The Swiss just did a deal with the Chinese. It's not Indonesia. This isn't Bhutan. This is Switzerland, right? Doing a deal with the Chinese to close certain trade settlements in renminbi and not dollars. This is a massive advancement. It's happening more and more and more every single day. And again, the U.S. government can't affect this anymore. And we see the Russians jumping in bed with the Chinese, and of course, the U.S. government is practically begging the Russians to jump in bed with the Chinese. And by every sanction that they make against Russia, they make China more powerful. It's utterly obscene. It's foolish. It is the most ridiculous thing that they could possibly. It's the exact opposite of what their objectives are. And it's hard to for really a person to imagine. Do they just not understand this, or do they understand it? And that's really their objective. It's very difficult to even comprehend what they're thinking, but the end result is very clear. And with this whole idea of, again, I mean, back to this Jim Rickards adoptability scale, I think it's the same thing with with money in banking. Let's say the future of the banking system, all this, the peer-to-peer technology and cryptocurrencies and so forth. It's probably not going to be what we have today. There's going to be a second generation, third generation, fourth generation, and so forth. But more and more people begin to adopt this. It's like anything else. More and more people started using Facebook. What happened? As more people started using Facebook, more people started to use Facebook. That's a normal adoption curve. As more people start to use peer-to-peer lending, as more people start to use digital currencies, as more people start to use whatever the future generation of this technology is, more people are going to start using it. And as more people start to use that, it makes the banks less and less and less powerful. So to me, it's the obvious trend is that the existing monetary system, this dollar-based New York banking system dominated, global financial system, is totally obsolete. I don't think it's going to take 20 years. I think it'd probably take 10 years, 5 years, hell, maybe 6 months. Again, we don't really know. We don't really know. All the data is there. The data is very clear. The current, I mean, you just look at the newspaper headlines. It's very clear what's happening. The trend's already there. The technology exists. All this stuff is happening right now. It's happening right in front of our eyes. And people who just want to be like, play ostrich and just stick their head in the sand and pretend like it's not happening and say, it's going to be king dollar forever and USA #1 and the New York banks are the best in the world and so forth, it's just setting themselves up to be completely abused, because this stuff is changing right in front of our eyes. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the future is going to be, full of, pain and suffering and so forth. Like I said, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future. Because one of the lessons that we always teach people, and this was in a presentation that I gave to the students, there's a lot of great lessons from history, is that the world's superpower is always changing. There have been a number of superpowers, the Macedonians and the Egyptians and the Romans and the Ottomans and the ancient Sumerians. There's always been a dominant superpower in the world. Today, it just happens to be the United States. Just barely. And that dominant superpower is always changing. This time is no different. That the sort of prevailing, social contract is always changing. We've passed through the feudal system. We've passed through empires and kingdoms and so forth. And we're sort of in this kleptocratic, state-sponsored corporate welfare system right now where, governments award huge monopolies to banks and, big companies like Monsanto and so forth. This system changes periodically. Usually it changes through conflict and revolution and turmoil and so forth, but it does change. And again, we're sort of in a similar transition period right now. Oftentimes it changes because of technology. The agricultural revolution substantially changed this. The Black Plague actually substantially changed this. It forced the plague actually forced a lot of changes in increases in individual liberty and started to actually hearken the rise of the Renaissance and individual liberty. This was a huge thing. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of the end of feudalism and the rise of the nation state. Technology plays a huge role in this, and this technology exists now. Another lesson from history is that the system of money and banking is always changing. And of course, this time is no different. We've had this since 1971. We've had this fiat currency system where central bankers just conjure money out of thin air and everybody else is just supposed to trust them to be good guys. It's an absurd system. It's lasted for over 40 years. It's on the way out. That system is always changing. There have been so many reserve currencies in the world. The Byzantine solidus and the Venetian ducat and the florin and pieces of eight, the Spanish dollar and the British pound and so forth. And so there have been so many different reserve currencies in the world. The fact that the U.S. dollar is currently the reserve currency is historically irrelevant because it's going to change. It always does. There's no reserve currency in the world that has lasted forever. There have been so many of them. This time is not different. The fourth lesson that we always teach people is that anytime this stuff changes, the prevailing social contract, the superpower, the system of money and banking, it's rarely smooth or peaceful. We see wars and we see revolutions and we see periods of significant inflation, as we saw in 1971. We see all these things anytime that's a major change to the system. But the lesson that I always leave people with is that humanity always prevails. No matter what problems our quote, leaders get themselves into, what our esteemed politicians drag the world into this, no matter how many bombs and drones and missiles and wars and tanks and death they cause, no matter how much value they take from other people, human beings always prevail. we rise. We create technologies. We find solutions. Human beings rise. And if there's one trend, one absolutely positive, sure trend that you can bet on, it's that human beings will prevail. And this is the thing that I always leave myself with. When I leave energized, I spend 5 days on my feet, constantly talking, teaching, all the other instructors. I mean, these people fly this. I mean, what a great bunch of instructors. I mean, these guys fly from halfway across the world on their own dime and ask for absolutely nothing other than the opportunity to stand in front of bright young people and teach them everything that they've been able to learn in their lives. And everybody's standing up there for days and days just trying to give and give and give as much as we possibly can, trying to arm the next generation of warriors out there to stand up, create value, see the world for what it is. It is tremendously exciting. And when I see this, I'm convinced that this final lesson, humanity always prevails. Human beings rise. And it's happening right in front of our very eyes, and I'm really proud to be part of this story. I'm really proud to be able to do something, however tiny it is, with just a few dozen people in front of us at this camp. I'm tremendously proud and privileged and honored to be able to do that. If you're listening and you attended our camp, I want to humbly thank you for coming. It was an absolute blast. If you're one of the instructors, I want to humbly thank you for coming. It was an absolute privilege to stand by your side, shoulder to shoulder, and be able to help influence young minds. I would encourage anybody who's listening out there to give it a try and think about it. We'll be doing it again next year, as we always do. And even if not, definitely consider these lessons and these important lessons from history. And with that, I want to go ahead and conclude and thank everybody once again for listening. I told you last week, after all this time in Ukraine and seeing war and revolution and an entire country about to disintegrate, I promise you I wanted to leave you with something inspirational. And especially for me, these last few days being around bright, energized young people was truly inspiring and leaves me with absolute optimism, confidence in the future. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks very much. And we'll talk to you again soon.